At affairrecovery.com, we're always trying to produce content that is hopeful and encouraging. Within that space is the realization that not every marriage makes it and survives infidelity. From time to time, I bring in guests who have been divorced. Some of them have remarried, some of them are still divorced. And today, I have the honor of interviewing a great friend. She came in probably 2 years or so ago and just rocked everybody's world. In fact, when I was interviewing her, I was taking notes because it was so palpable, the courage, the honesty, the encouragement that I felt from what Lisa Arends had to give. Today, she's going to share more about her own journey. She's going to provide insight for those that are remarried and have had to divorce. She's also going to share more about her own story of divorce. Lisa Arends is a blogger. She's going to also give you information on a new career change in her life. She's written a wonderful book. If you haven't read it yet, I highly suggest that you get on Amazon and read Lessons from the End of a Marriage. She's become a friend, but she's also become a source of hope, inspiration, and raw courage. This woman, in my opinion, is the epitome of courage and how to face circumstances that you certainly never asked for and can certainly feel overwhelming and like there isn't any way through them. As she shares her story, you'll find that there is definitely a way through hopelessness, despair, and just absolute uncertainty. So I hope you enjoy today's interview with Lisa Arends. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Samuel. I am overjoyed to bring a friend of mine back in the studio. Her name is Lisa Arends. She's the author of Lessons from the End of a Marriage, How I Found Happiness While Surviving Bigamy, Abandonment, and Deceit. She is now a former math teacher, which she will share more about as we talk today. Her website, if you haven't visited it before, is called Lessons from the End of a Marriage. She's a friend. She's a divorce expert. She has a story that's not only compelling, but incredibly brave and courageous. Hi, Lisa, and thank you for joining us again today.
Thank you for having me back.
You know, last time I interviewed you, you'll remember I had a pen and I was constantly writing some things down that you would say that were just so intriguing, courageous, brave. And I rewatched that interview the other day. And I have to tell you, as I have gotten to know you, and we certainly follow each other on Twitter, we retweet each other all the time. I've read so many of your writing. You are one of the most courageous and resilient women that I have had the pleasure of interviewing. I'm so thankful that you have come back in the studio with me today. So thank you for being here.
Wow, I'm honored. Thank you.
Well, don't be too honored. I can screw this up just like anybody. But let's talk just quickly. So you are now a former math teacher. Tell us about what's now going on in your life.
So I've been a math teacher for 20 years. And one of the things that I always preach to my students is that it's always important to grow and that it's always important for us to learn. And I realized that I was sort of stagnant in my career. And so I am taking a great leap of faith and moving on to a new career with data science and practicing what I preach about getting out of the comfort zone.
That's fantastic. As we kind of walk into this world, I don't think there's ever a shortage in adulthood of the need to be brave, the need to be courageous. And that sounds awesome, and people make movies about it, and it's phenomenal until you have to work through past trauma and disappointment and hurt and incredible grief. But there's also something that I want to talk about today. And as you can tell, I want to jump right into it because this is something that is in your wheelhouse. And that is the shame of divorce. You know, so many of my followers are contemplating divorce at one time or another after infidelity or addiction. Some of them already have divorced and are navigating through that. Some of them are kind of staring divorce in the face and say, It might be what I need to do, but I'm scared to death to do that. But the factor that I want to talk about as we kind of jump into this is the shame of divorce, the social shame. You know, the shame of infidelity or addiction is off the chart, but you can kind of work to hide that a little bit. You can't really hide divorce. You have to kind of walk into that season of your life. And so from your story, from what you've had to walk through, talk a little bit about the shame of divorce and what you had to process through.
Sure. So I'm first going to just share with you a brief story. It was only a couple weeks after my ex-husband abandoned me, and then I discovered the betrayal. And so I had just finished telling a coworker who had asked about what was happening, and I just gave her the little elevator speech. And she said, "Well, what did you do?" And from my perspective at that moment, I interpreted that as saying, what did I do wrong to cause all of these things to happen to me? Because that's where I was in my own head. But it was only in retrospect that I realized what she was actually asking wasn't that. She was coming from a place of empathy of, oh my goodness, I can't imagine being in that position. What in the world did you do to make it through those first few moments? And I think that that's so much of all of this shame is, you know, we do have those external factors. We have those people, those institutions that tell us that, you know, divorce is never an option. And so when we find ourselves in that place, we do hear those things from those outside sources. But the reason that those messages are so hard to hear is because they're echoing what we are so afraid of in ourselves. We are so worried that somehow we failed, or that we're broken, or that we're a complete screw up. And we think that they see that in us.
And I think so often we are pounded with messages of, oh, you're divorced. What a failure you must be. And it's so great that you just talked about that. So how do you combat the voices, the shame of feeling like a failure because the marriage failed?
So first, it's a process. It's not going to be a quick switch. And there's a few things. One of the things that was most powerful for me as far as the external voices were concerned, and this was mainly those that kept telling me, well, in my world, divorce is never an option. No matter what happens, my husband and I will always work through it, blah, 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 which of course was the last thing I needed to hear. What I realized though was where they're coming from. They were so afraid of divorce themselves, and they wanted to believe that it was something that could not happen to them. And so they needed to paint it as where somehow I messed up and that's why it happened, because it made them feel safe. And once I realized that, it took me, because before that I was really defensive when people would come to me and say, well, that's not an option, and, you know, sort of shame all over me. And I would be really defensive and really angry. And then once I realized that they were coming from a place of fear, it helped me actually have more empathy. And I started to actually respond to them of, I'm so grateful that you have never had an experience that shows you otherwise.
That's, I mean, probably the most gracious response that you could have right there. Absolutely, because it's so hard to not, what I call, turtle up and die when someone, I don't want to use the word, they project their stuff on you, but they just shame you without even understanding it, or they make these faces and you just kind of go, oh my gosh, I want to scratch your eyes out, right?
Yes. And then the other part too was doing the internal work, you know, because it was one thing to silence those voices from outside, but let's be honest, those aren't the really damaging ones. The really damaging ones are the ones that are in our heads 24/7. And I know for me, a lot of the shame came from my feeling of, I'm a problem solver. I'm a hard worker. I'm not the type of person that gives up on things. And so for this to happen to me really went against kind of my own identity. For some people, they come from a family or maybe a church that says, you don't give up on marriage. And so they're having to fight those voices. And then I also had my ex's voice in my head because as part of the infidelity and the abandonment and all of that, he completely projected and gaslighted and all of those things. And so he blamed me for everything. And so I really had to do a lot of work of kind of separating all those other voices out from really what was happening inside of me. And I had to recognize that failure wasn't the end of the marriage. Failure would be if I gave up on myself.
Whew! So I don't have any pens with me this morning. And I think that I love how when you answer these questions that you bring it back to personal bravery. So how did you not give up on yourself?
I got angry. That's honestly the truth at the beginning. It was, so much has been taken from me without my choice. I will not allow that to destroy the rest of my life. I will not allow this to define me. And at the beginning, it was just pure anger. It was, but anger has an energy to it. And in the beginning, when we're so devastated, use that anger, just make sure you're pointing it in the right direction, basically, because at first I wanted to destroy him, which that's not going to be helpful. But if I could turn instead that energy around and use it to sort of propel me past that initial hump into a better life, that's anger that's worthwhile. That's anger that's well spent. And so that was a big piece of it in the beginning, was just, I am not going to let this situation define me.
I love that there's so much rich wisdom. A while ago, I went to the doctor and I had to fill out the emergency contact info. And I had to put my oldest son instead of Samantha. And it was paralyzing to sit there. And at that point, while what you're referring to, anger can really help move you, at that point, I felt, number one, like I was on the planet Jupiter by myself, just crashing through space. I took a few deep breaths, and then I think I felt immense grief and sadness. So when the anger runs out, or when the anger isn't applicable, Lisa, what do you do with the grief? What do you do with the sadness? What do you do with the despair? Because that is, next to the anger, it's probably the most prevalent feeling that people who deal with divorce have to experience.
I would say it is the most prevalent. I would say anger is just that sadness when it's screaming to be heard. I think that grief is what we feel more than anything else. I talked about, you said on being on Jupiter. To me, it was the sense of like being unmoored. I had no anchor at all. And which is a really scary feeling. We all want to kind of have that home base, that place of safety, and then we can grow from there. And then with divorce, that's gone. And you just feel this complete isolation and uncertainty. And it's scary. And yes, you are so focused on what you have lost. And I think a big thing is recognizing when it's appropriate to distract yourself from that and when it's not. There's kind of in the moment, you're going to have to do some distraction just to make it through the day. You're going to have to do some of that so you can do your job, so that you can be a parent and all of those things. But it's not something that you can just like pack away into a box and tuck it away and never face it, because it's going to come back. And it's one of those where it doesn't feel like you're strong enough to take all that grief. And you have to trust in your body. It's not going to allow you to face more at one time than you can handle. And it's going to come. And when it does, you just have to be willing to go through it, because the only way that you can move on from the loss, and it is a loss, is to acknowledge that and grieve it. And that's when you can then start to rebuild. But there's no rushing through it.
And I think the word rebuild is so key because you have to, it's funny. Now, when you deal with infidelity, it has a way of stirring up every unresolved hurt and pain and trauma, whether it's like for me, whether it's stuff with my mom, stuff with baseball when I was 9 to when I was 20 something playing professional baseball it just stirs everything up. Now, divorce has a way of re-stirring every single thing up in your life where it all just comes to your face. And I love the vision of not giving up on yourself, because what I've learned is, look, yes, I have my kids and I have my close family, and at the end of the day, I have to respect myself. I have to love myself. Loving ourselves has become more popular. It used to be looked upon as super weird, new agey. Now it's like, look, even the Bible talks about love your neighbor as you love yourself. And we have to cherish ourselves. We have to care for ourselves. When you were going through so much of just the pain and the hurt and the grief, how did you prioritize yourself? I guess what I'm also asking is, for someone that's in the middle of, they just experienced divorce. That could be a year. That could be several years if they haven't been able to do the self-care that they need. How does someone prioritize themselves? How do they begin to really say, okay, like Lisa said, I'm not giving up on me. Now what do they do?
So first, I love how you talked about the time on that. And one of the things I like to say is that grief does not speak calendar.
Mm-hmm.
I know for me, I had this okay, when the divorce is final, I'm going to be at this point. Oh, 1 year out, I'm going to be at this point. I'll be completely frank. I am now 12 years out. And the triggers and all of that are few and far between now, but they still happen. I still have moments. I had a moment just a few weeks ago where all of a sudden, I deeply missed my ex-husband. All of a sudden, those things will still happen. The difference, though, is that you learn how to move through those, and they don't bring you down quite so much. They don't have quite the same emotional intensity to them as they do at the beginning. But it's still going to be there. This has happened. This has changed you. It is a part of your story. And that's okay. It makes us all the richer.
It really does. My therapist said to me a while ago, and we had this moment, and he said, okay, and now my therapist talks to me a little bit differently than other people. My therapist, who I'm trying to bring him in, but he basically said, okay, can you shut up for a minute? I want to walk you through a timeline. I said, yeah. And so I actually didn't, because he says that a lot. I said, yeah, sure, let's do it. And he said, you made it through this. You made it through this. Remember that? We talked about that. We made it through this. And you made it through all these things. Why are you not going to make it through this right now? And with tears streaming down my face, I was like, you're right, okay, and it was so hard to, this is going to sound weird, and we didn't talk about this, but it's so hard to give yourself the benefit of the doubt and not be like that person in the elevator where you just go, yeah, I'm a piece of crap. I'm a failure. I'm worthless. My life is over. Maybe talk about that war to not just pile on to the dark voices that tell us we're a failure and we're always going to be a failure, when we forget how many things we have come through. Lisa, you've come through some of the darkest things a wife has had to come through with your story. How did you not just go and lay down and die?
One of the things I did when you're talking about that internal narrative that can become so damaging is I recognized that I was doing that. I was telling myself all of these things about, you're unlovable, you're unworthy, you're not enough. I had this just running through my head all the time. And what I started to do is I actually started to take those voices and I started to put it in writing. And to kind of take it outside of myself a little bit. I put it in writing, but I didn't stop there. Then I started in writing to refute what that said. So it was like, I'm unlovable was one of the ones that kept going through my head. And then I actually took an entire weekend and I went through all of the emails and cards and voicemails and all of the support that I had coming into me. And I compiled that and wrote that down to refute that claim I was telling myself that I was unlovable. Because we lie to ourselves. We really do. And sometimes we need somebody on the outside, like our therapist or our friend or somebody to go, hey, no, idiot, that's not right. But we also can do that ourselves. Just you have to be aware of it and you have to be willing to admit to yourself that sometimes those voices in our head aren't real, that even though we're feeling it, it may not be the truth.
And I love that because, that's what therapists, good friends, priests, rabbis, pastors, small group. I'm a big fan of group work. That's what they help us do, is they remind us, hey, hold on here. You're cascading over the waterfall of condemnation and doubt and forgetfulness. And I think it's so vital that we have people in our life that can go, hey, think, 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 think. They can get on the camera glass of our life and go, let me remind you of a few things. And, I think we're all in transition at one time or another. We're transitioning through. I'm navigating through some health issues that I was like, man, I never had to worry about this kind of stuff. This is ridiculous, right? There's transitions of divorce. There's just life transitions that we go through. You're in the middle of kind of a transition right now. You've had to do a lot of work. We've kind of talked off camera about that. Why don't you share a little bit about, transitions require a part of us that sometimes we haven't discovered yet, but it's the transition that actually introduces us to that part of ourselves. And we can kind of go, man, I'm stronger than I thought. I actually am doing this. This scared the hell out of me, but I'm actually doing it. So tell us a little bit about your transition right now and how you're making it through it.
I just have to say, this is the biggest change I've ever made in my life by choice. The other major change for me was divorce, but that wasn't something I had choice about. And even though I've been, in sort of that divorce world now for about 10, 11 years, going through this transition myself has given me so much more empathy for those of you that have had the courage to make a choice like this, to make those transitions, because it is not easy. Because we love our comfort zones, even if the comfort zone isn't good.
Right.
It's that whole, we tell ourselves, well, at least this is a known bad thing. Whereas if I take this risk, well, then it's an unknown bad thing and it might be even worse. And we tell ourselves that if we don't make a decision, if we stay put, that nothing changes. But that's not true. Even if we don't make a change, everything else is still going to change around us. So we might as well make changes and choices that we choose.
It's interesting. Everything that we talk about today brings me back to a resilience and a bravery that, our friends, therapists, outside forces can help, but it really has to come from inside because we have to do the work. And some days we don't freaking want to do the work, Lisa. Some days, for me, there's been days I'd love to go get just a big bottle of whiskey and call it good and lock everybody out. And have my own pity party, or maybe even just my own shame party, and just let all the voices run ragged. Just let all the voices of darkness, of shame, of pity, just let them all have it. Just go, okay, I have fought you long enough. Go ahead and run ragged. And then there's days where I'm like, no, I am kicking back. I am punching back. I'm a big proponent that there's times where we have to learn how to punch back against the condemnation, against the shame, against just the internal narrative, if you will, and sometimes the external narrative that comes our way. How did you, and we didn't talk about this, so I'm throwing this off the cuff, how did you learn to fight back, and what does it mean to you as a survivor of divorce? You're remarried, very successful at what you do, very compassionate and very present with those who are in pain. How did you learn how to fight back and punch back? What does it mean for you to punch back, to survive what you've been through?
I think for me, that would come from taking ownership of the narrative
Mm.
and of taking all of that shame, because the shame really, it grows in the dark. And so obviously when all of this happened and I felt so much shame, sort of the natural inclination is just to like, hide and to, don't look at me, let's not talk about it, just sort of pretend that none of this happened. But that just made those feelings grow. And so my way of punching back was going public. My way of punching back was saying, all of this happened. I'm now going to find my voice and I am going to use this to do some good. And I'm going to tell my story. And also, in a weird way, I'm going to allow myself to be the punching bag for others that aren't ready to share yet, that are feeling so fragile. Because by putting myself out there, I'm the one that gets those really hurtful comments and everything. And I'm okay with that because I'm at a place right now where I can take that, but others aren't. And then by doing that, I can start to have these conversations with people. And coming from a place of punching back, but punching back with empathy, I guess is how I would say it. So it's listening to people wherever they are, and then helping them to sort of expand their way of thinking and maybe to look at things from a different perspective.
It's incredibly unselfish what you said, because you're talking about leaning in. You're talking about, hey, bring it, let's go. And we're not all there yet. We're trying. Some people are, some people aren't. And the thing I've learned from divorce and what I've heard from people is, you can be a decade down the road and still struggle immensely. But the bravery, the resilience, the courage, the self-love that we learn helps carry us, sure. But, I've heard so many people for so long, for the faith community, God hates divorce. And my number one response was, yeah, but he does not hate divorcees. And there's so many messages that we just can overwhelm us and overtake us. And I know for those that are out there that this interview is resonating with them, I'm going to ask you to do something, Lisa, because I think you're so good at this. It's going to be simple for you. But take a minute, talk to the person, male or female, that is really overwhelmed with all that we're talking about today. Maybe they're in the middle of a divorce. Maybe they're on the brink of it. Maybe they are divorced and they're just lost, trying to find help. Take a moment, tell them what you wished someone would have told you when you were in that space.
I know that it can be such an invisible feeling when you're in the middle of divorce or just out of divorce. It seems like nobody else understands what you're going through and the enormity of what you're feeling. Because before you were divorced, you probably had this image of what divorce was like. And you've learned since then that it's so much more, isn't it? It doesn't leave a stone unturned. So I see you. And I'm so sorry that you are in this situation. I also want you to know that you are strong enough to move beyond this. You are not going to be where you are forever. So what I want you to do is I want you to focus on small, tiny, tiny little goals and then baby steps towards those goals. Now, when I say tiny, I'm going to give you an example from my life. One of my first goals was literally being able to eat one frozen waffle for dinner because I was so devastated I could not eat. And that was my first goal, just be able to get one frozen waffle down. And when I say baby steps, I mean baby. That took me 2 weeks. But you know what? I got there. And then I made another little goal. And I took that other little step. And if you just keep doing that and you just keep looking forward and make sure that most of your energy is spent moving forward, where you are today is not where you will always be. You will be okay again.
I'm going to basically save that on my phone and listen to that when I'm having a moment. I mean, Lisa, I'm so honored that you would take the time to come in and, you know, you have so many great things to say, but what I love is you share from your heart. You're not just sharing little quotes that you have, regurgitated. You're talking about how you have survived. And for those of us who've been through infidelity and trauma, man, when there's a certain way a trauma survivor talks, and that's why it's so important to get help from people who've actually been through it before, because they just get it. There's a certain way you talk, there's a certain way you live, there's a certain way you just have a tenacity and a strength about you. So my final thought is tell people where they can find you, where they can read more about you, about your book. I want as many people who are in crisis and looking for inspiration to know the easiest ways to find you.
Sure. So my website is Lessons from the End of a Marriage, and I am on Twitter and Instagram at Still Learning to Be, and I also have a YouTube channel under my name.
Well, once again, thank you for coming in. I can't wait to have you in again, because every time you come in, it warms my heart. It gives me bravery to keep going. So, Lisa, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me on. I enjoyed it.